When I first bought the small commercial building on Maple Ridge Avenue, I never thought it would drag me into the most absurd, petty power struggle of my life. The property wasn't exactly prime real estate, an aging two-story brick structure with fading white trim, a cracked parking lot, and an air conditioning unit that groaned like a dying bear in summer. But I saw potential. I'd spent the better part of my career managing construction sites and flipping small properties on the side. This one had a stable lineup of tenants, a dentist's office, a local insurance agency, and, tucked into Suite 2B upstairs, the Oak Ridge Homeowners Association, the same HOA that managed the suburban neighborhood where I'd recently bought my home. At first, the irony didn't even register. I didn't realize the same overbearing HOA that mailed me 3 violation notices in my first month for having my garbage bins visible on the side of the house was renting office space in my building. I bought the property through a holding company, which kept my name off the signage and records, so no one, including the HOA board, knew who their landlord actually was. To them, I was just Mr. Bennett, another homeowner in their community who they could bully around with fine letters and their smug monthly newsletters. When I first moved into Oak Ridge, I tried to play along. I went to a few meetings, paid my dues on time, and even volunteered to help fix the community playground that had a slide duct taped together like a bad hospital cast. But it didn't take long for me to realize how rotten the leadership was, especially the president, Karen Wilson. Yes, her name really was Karen. She fit the stereotype perfectly, the sharp bob haircut, pastel blazers, and a voice that could slice through drywall. She ran the HOA like a personal fiefdom, barking at residents during meetings, dismissing suggestions, and inventing new, aesthetic standards whenever someone painted their front door a color she didn't like. It started small. A $25 reminder fee for leaving my recycling bin out an hour too long. Then a $75 fine for having non-compliant exterior lighting, even though I just replaced my bulbs with the exact model they listed on their own guidelines. When I pushed back, citing the HOA's own bylaws, Karen smiled that condescending smile and said, "Rules are subject to board interpretation." That's when I decided to stop being a pushover. The more I dug into the HOA's operations, the shadier things looked. They weren't just strict, they were creative with their finances. Annual dues had gone up nearly 30% in 2 years, but neighborhood maintenance had dropped to almost nothing. The lawns around the entrance sign looked like hay, the pool had cracked spider webbing across the bottom, and the so-called community patrol car was nothing more than a rusted SUV with a magnet sticker slapped on the door. Yet every month, the board's budget summary listed thousands spent on administrative costs. I started asking questions at meetings, politely at first. Things like, can residents see a breakdown of those administrative expenses, and when will the pool repairs begin since funds were approved last quarter? Every time, Karen brushed me off with that same fake sweet tone, "That's board business, Mr. Bennett. You can submit a written request." When I did submit a written request, I was told the documents were not available for review due to confidentiality. That's when I started digging deeper, using my professional experience to trace payments through public filings. I discovered that the HOA's administrative service vendor, which billed them $3,000 a month, was a company owned by, you guessed it, Karen's brother-in-law. Another $2,000 monthly expense for community outreach events went to a consultant who turned out to be Karen's close friend from her old PDA board. I wasn't angry at first. I was fascinated. The HOA wasn't just incompetent, it was a miniature monarchy hiding under the guise of neighborhood management. And without realizing it, they had been paying me rent for the last year. When my property management company forwarded me the tenant list for renewals, I nearly spit out my coffee. There it was, Oak Ridge Homeowners Association, Suite 2B. The lease was due for renewal in 3 months. That's when the idea formed, slow, deliberate, like the tightening of a bowstring. I wasn't going to storm in and expose them yet. I was going to wait, watch, and let them tie their own noose. 3 weeks later, I got a letter in my mailbox, one of those HOA envelopes I could recognize from a mile away. Inside was a notice stating I was being summoned to an HOA hearing for repeated violations, including improper waste bin storage, unapproved landscaping modifications, and my personal favorite, disruptive behavior during meetings. Disruptive? I'd asked for transparency, that was my crime. I attended the hearing. Karen sat at the center of a long folding table, flanked by 2 other board members who nodded at everything she said like bobbleheads on a dashboard. She looked down her nose and said, "Mr. Bennett, the board has voted to impose a $500 fine for noncompliance and to suspend your voting privileges until further notice." I kept a straight face. You can't suspend voting rights without due process. It's in your bylaws. Karen smirked. We can, and we did. If you're unhappy, you can appeal in writing. This meeting is over. She tapped her little gavel, yes, she actually had a miniature gavel, and moved on to the next victim. That's when I knew I wasn't dealing with ignorance. I was dealing with arrogance. Over the next few weeks, I started receiving more absurd notices, fines for grass too long when I'd mowed it 2 days earlier, warnings about visible tools in my garage when my door was closed. It was clear they were trying to harass me into submission. But what they didn't realize was that they were harassing the landlord of their very own office. When the renewal packet for the HOA's lease came across my desk, I almost laughed out loud. Their current rent was already well below market rate, $950 a month for a 1,200 square foot office. I could easily raise it to $1,400 without blinking. Instead, I decided to make the terms even more interesting. I drafted a new lease agreement through my property manager, adding clauses that required tenants to adhere to all applicable community regulations and maintain a cooperative relationship with property ownership. Nothing legally unusual, just vague enough to be a loaded gun if they acted up. Then I added one more line, hidden deep in the fine print: tenant's lease may be terminated at any time upon 30 days written notice if landlord determines the tenant's conduct is detrimental to the building's community relations. My property manager sent it out, and 3 days later, I got a call. "Hey, Mr. Bennett," she said, hesitantly. "The Oak Ridge HOA board president is on the phone asking to speak directly with you. She seems upset." "Put her through," I said, already smiling. Karen's voice came on, sharp as broken glass. "Mr. Bennett? This is Karen Wilson, president of the Oak Ridge Homeowners Association. We just received a lease renewal that looks, well, frankly, outrageous. What are these community relations clauses supposed to mean?" "Oh," I said casually, "just standard terms for all tenants. Helps maintain harmony between the tenants and ownership." "That's ridiculous. We've been here for years. We expect the same terms as before." "I understand," I replied smoothly. "But these are the new policies. You're welcome to vacate if they don't suit your organization's needs." There was a long pause. I could practically hear her grinding her teeth. "We'll review it," she finally said, then hung up. 2 days later, they begrudgingly signed and returned the lease. It was almost too perfect. The same HOA that fined me for trivial nonsense was now legally bound by a lease that could be ended at my discretion. I didn't plan to use that power immediately. I wanted them comfortable, confident, blind. A month later came the board's quarterly meeting, the big one, open to all homeowners. I attended as usual, sitting quietly in the back as Karen strutted to the podium like a queen addressing her subjects. The meeting was held in none other than Suite 2B, my property, my electricity, my chairs, my air conditioning. But that night would become legendary. It started like any other, complaints about street parking, discussions about tree trimming, the usual petty drama. Then I raised my hand and asked about the latest special assessment fee they were imposing, a $200 charge per household for office renovations. Karen frowned. "Mr. Bennett, this is a members-only discussion. Non-board members cannot speak during budget review." "I'm a member," I said calmly. "Not anymore," she snapped. "Your voting privileges are suspended, remember? That means you're not permitted to participate." Some of the neighbors shifted uncomfortably. One even muttered, "That doesn't sound right." Karen ignored them. "Please leave the room, Mr. Bennett. You're not authorized to attend this portion of the meeting." I stood slowly, holding back a grin. "Karen," I said evenly, "you might want to check your lease agreement before you throw me out." Her eyes narrowed. "Excuse me? This office, Suite 2B, belongs to me. I'm the landlord. You're holding your little meeting on my property. So unless you're planning to violate the tenant agreement and risk eviction, I suggest you sit down and let me finish my question." The room went dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop. Karen blinked rapidly, her face turning a deep shade of crimson. That's absurd. I pulled a folded document from my folder, a copy of the signed lease, with my company's name at the top and her signature at the bottom. "I assure you," I said, "it's not absurd. It's business." Her mouth opened and closed like a goldfish gasping for air. The rest of the room erupted in whispers. And that was only the beginning. The silence in that room was thick enough to cut with a knife. For the first time since I'd moved into Oak Ridge, Karen Wilson didn't have a script. Her face went from crimson to pale in seconds as the realization set in, the smug, rule-breaker, homeowner she'd been trying to bully was actually the person signing her office lease. For a long beat, no one spoke. Then a man in the second row, old Mr. Coleman, cleared his throat and said, "Wait, so you're the landlord of this office?" I nodded, still holding the lease in my hand. "Through my property company, yes. The Oak Ridge HOA rents this suite from me. Been that way for about a year and a half." The reaction was instant. A ripple of murmurs rolled through the crowd. Even some of the board members turned to look at Karen, who suddenly found the floor extremely interesting. I didn't gloat, not yet. I'd learned long ago that victory always tastes better when served slow. Instead, I tucked the paper back into my folder and calmly said, "Now, since this is my property, and since this meeting affects all paying homeowners, I'll be staying. Please, continue." For a moment, I thought Karen was going to explode. Her lips trembled, but she forced a tight smile and muttered something about moving on. The meeting limped forward, but the authority in her voice was gone. Every word she spoke dripped with caution. That night changed everything. Word spread through the neighborhood faster than wildfire in July. By the next morning, my phone was buzzing with texts from neighbors I barely knew. "You really own the HOA office? That's legendary. Heard you shut Karen down at the meeting, you're a hero. Can we all chip in to buy her a one-way ticket out of Oak Ridge?" It was hilarious, but I knew better than to underestimate Karen. People like her don't crumble quietly. They regroup, rebuild, and come back swinging twice as hard. And she did. Within a week, I started noticing subtle retaliation. A letter appeared on my doorstep claiming I had unauthorized lawn fixtures, referring to the small stone birdbath that had been in my yard for months. Then another warning arrived about improper window coverings. My girlfriend, Mia, laughed when she saw it. "They're curtains, not a crime scene," she said, waving the notice in the air. "Karen's poking the bear," I muttered. Mia grinned. Then maybe it's time the bear pokes back. She was right. It was time to stop reacting and start acting. I drafted a formal notice to the HOA through my management company, professional, polite, but with a bite sharp enough to draw blood. It read, "Notice of lease review. Due to ongoing tenant conduct that may constitute a violation of Section 7, Clause 3, detrimental to community relations, landlord reserves the right to review and potentially terminate lease upon further notice." I had it sent via certified mail, knowing full well Karen would be the one signing for it. 3 days later, I was woken by the sound of someone pounding on my front door. When I opened it, Karen stood there, red-faced, clutching the letter. "This is harassment," she shouted before I could even say good morning. "Harassment?" I said, sipping my coffee. "Karen, it's a standard notice. Nothing personal. Just business. You can't evict a homeowners association." "Of course I can," I said mildly. "You're tenants. Your organization rents space like anyone else. If I decide it's bad for the building, I can terminate the lease in 30 days. Her jaw dropped. "This is an abuse of power." I smiled. "You mean like fining me for grass that wasn't long?" She glared, sputtered something unintelligible, then stormed off my porch. I watched her leave, knowing this wasn't over. People like Karen don't back down, they escalate. And escalate she did. A few days later, the HOA website suddenly featured a new article titled, "Maintaining Integrity in Our Community," filled with vague jabs about dishonest individuals and conflicts of interest. It didn't name me directly, but everyone knew who it was aimed at. My mailbox started filling with anonymous complaint slips, half of them written in the same precise, slanted handwriting. But while Karen was busy playing petty politics, I was quietly collecting ammunition. I'd already been gathering evidence of her financial shenanigans. Now, with the lease in my pocket, I had leverage. I requested a financial disclosure from the HOA under the state's nonprofit transparency laws, something most residents didn't even know they had the right to do. Predictably, Karen ignored it. So I filed a formal complaint with the county's Community Association Oversight Office. 2 weeks later, an inspector requested an audit. That's when the dominoes started falling. The board tried to stonewall the auditors, but it didn't take long before the numbers started painting a clear picture: inflated vendor fees, duplicate payments, and consulting invoices that didn't match any actual services rendered. When the report came out, it was damning. Karen's brother-in-law's company had billed the HOA for nearly $40,000 in administrative support that no one could verify. The board panicked. 2 members resigned overnight. Karen tried to spin it as a misunderstanding, but the residents weren't buying it anymore. The next community meeting was standing room only. I sat near the front, calm as ever, while Karen faced an increasingly hostile crowd. One woman shouted, "Where's the money, Karen?" Another demanded, "Why did your brother-in-law get paid with our dues?" Karen's voice cracked as she tried to restore order. "Please, everyone, these are baseless accusations." "They're not baseless," I said, standing slowly. "They're in the audit report. Page 7. Every head turned toward me. I walked up to the front table, holding a copy of the report. "You used your position to funnel money to your relatives and punish anyone who asked questions. That's not leadership. That's corruption." Karen's hands shook. You don't understand the complexities of HOA administration." "I understand plenty," I said. "I also understand your organization operates out of my building, and under your lease terms, engaging in conduct that damages community relations is grounds for termination." Gasps filled the room. Karen's face turned a frightening shade of red. "You wouldn't dare." I smiled, leaning in just enough for her to hear. "I already have the notice drafted. The rest of the board members looked like they wanted to disappear into their chairs. I could have ended it there, issued the eviction, watched them scramble to find a new office, and called it a day. But something in me wanted to do this right. I didn't just want revenge. I wanted change. So instead, I offered them a choice. The lease is up for review, I announced to the room. I'll consider renewing it, but only if the current board resigns and new elections are held. Transparent ones. With proper financial oversight. The room erupted in applause. Karen shouted something about legality and bylaws, but no one listened anymore. The crowd had turned on her. Even the treasurer, a meek man who usually stayed silent, muttered, "Maybe it's time for a fresh start." In that moment, I saw it, the exact second her power slipped through her fingers. Within a week, a recall petition circulated through the neighborhood. It needed 50 signatures to force a special election. It got over 100. By the following month, the entire board, Karen included, was voted out. When the results were announced, I didn't gloat. I didn't even attend the final vote count. I was on my porch, sipping coffee, listening to the faint sound of cheering from down the street. The next day, Karen showed up at the HOA office early in the morning to clear out her things. My property manager happened to be there, finalizing paperwork for the new lease with the incoming board. She later told me Karen looked like a ghost, pale, shaky, muttering under her breath as she packed her binders and the infamous gavel into a box. A few days later, I found an envelope taped to my door. Inside was a single piece of paper with no greeting, just 4 words written in small, shaky letters, "You think you won." I smiled, folded it neatly, and dropped it into my shredder. Winning wasn't the point anymore. This wasn't about me versus Karen. This was about fairness, about reminding people that power doesn't always sit where it looks like it does. Sometimes it's hiding in plain sight, quietly holding the lease to the kingdom. Under the new board, things actually improved. Budgets were published online, violations were handled reasonably, and neighbors stopped living in fear of surprise fines. The tension in the community lifted like fog after a storm. And yet, every time I walked past Suite 2B, I couldn't help but smirk. Because behind that plain glass door with the HOA logo on it, I knew the truth, they were still paying me rent. For all their rules, for all their authority, for all their power trips, they still worked for me. It was poetic. But I had no idea the story wasn't over yet. Because just when I thought peace had finally returned to Oak Ridge, a letter arrived that would throw everything back into chaos, one with an official seal, a legal tone, and a subject line that made my stomach drop. Notice of pending litigation, property dispute, Karen wasn't done. The day that letter arrived, I almost laughed. I was standing in my kitchen, holding the thick envelope like it was a bad joke. Notice of pending litigation, property dispute. Karen's name wasn't on it directly, but the sender's address belonged to the same law firm her brother-in-law used for his bogus, administrative services. The coincidence was about as subtle as a marching band. Mia leaned over my shoulder. "You've got to be kidding me. She's suing you now?" I unfolded the papers and skimmed through. The claim was absurd. According to the filing, the HOA was challenging the validity of my property ownership, arguing that there were irregularities in the sale documents from 2 years earlier, the very purchase that had made me their landlord. It even accused me of harassing association operations through retaliatory lease practices. I set the papers down and rubbed my temples. This is desperate. Mia poured me a coffee. She's trying to drag you into court to bleed you dry. Classic Karen move. I nodded slowly. Then I guess it's time we remind her she's not the only one who knows how to play hardball. Over the next week, I gathered every scrap of documentation I had, the purchase agreement, title history, bank records, lease renewals, all of it. I called my attorney, a no-nonsense guy named Eric Lawson who'd handled a few of my property flips before. When he saw the complaint, he laughed outright. "This is one of the sloppiest filings I've seen in years. They don't even have standing to dispute your deed. Can we get it dismissed?" "Easily," Eric said. "But if you're in the mood to make a statement, we can countersue for defamation and breach of lease. They filed this in bad faith, and we can prove it." The thought tempted me. But I didn't want to look vindictive. What I wanted was finality, a clear end to Karen's circus. "Let's file a motion to dismiss first," I said. "If they keep pushing, then we hit back." Eric grinned. "Sounds good. Let's put her on the defensive." Meanwhile, word of the lawsuit spread through the neighborhood like a new season of a soap opera. Every walk around the block felt like stepping into a live-action gossip forum. Mrs. Dalton from across the street cornered me one morning. "Is it true Karen's trying to steal your building?" "She's trying something," I said. "But it's not going to work." "Oh, honey," she said, shaking her head. "That woman doesn't know when to quit. You just keep doing what you're doing." Even the new HOA president, a quiet but competent accountant named James Miller, called to apologize. "I want you to know the board didn't authorize this lawsuit," he said. "Karen filed it using old letterhead and a couple of her cronies who resigned before the election. We're as shocked as you are." "That makes sense," I said. "But she's still using the HOA's name on the filing." "We're drafting a cease and desist," he replied. "She doesn't represent us anymore." For the first time, I realized Karen might have overplayed her hand. 2 weeks later, we walked into the county courthouse for the hearing on the motion to dismiss. The courtroom was small, maybe 20 seats, but half the neighborhood showed up anyway, people sitting shoulder to shoulder, whispering excitedly. Karen was there, of course, sitting stiffly in a pale blue suit that probably cost more than her case was worth. Her attorney looked equally tense. When the judge entered, everyone stood. Eric leaned toward me and murmured, "Don't react, no matter how ridiculous this gets." The hearing lasted less than an hour. Karen's lawyer stumbled through a weak argument about potential deed irregularities and ethical concerns over dual relationships. Eric countered with certified property records, proof of ownership transfers, and a notarized affidavit from the title company. By the time he finished, the judge's eyebrows were halfway up his forehead. "Ms. Wilson," the judge said, turning toward Karen, "you filed this as a representative of the Oak Ridge Homeowners Association?" She nodded stiffly. "And you currently serve in that capacity?" Her voice cracked. "I did. Until recently." The judge frowned. "Then you lack standing. This court doesn't entertain personal vendettas disguised as civil disputes." Case dismissed. Bang. Gavel. Done. The entire gallery erupted in whispers. Karen's face went white. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Outside the courthouse, reporters from the local paper were waiting. Apparently the story had spread beyond our little suburb. Eric gave a brief statement, "My client has been vindicated. The claims were meritless." I didn't say much. Just one line for the article that would later go viral on the community news site. Sometimes the people who make the loudest rules are the first to break them. But even after her legal loss, Karen couldn't stop. She became an urban legend, a ghost haunting the edges of Oak Ridge. Residents spotted her driving by community events, glaring from her car window. Someone claimed she mailed anonymous flyers accusing the new board of colluding with the landlord. Another swore she hacked the HOA Facebook page before being banned. I tried to ignore it all, but one night, as I was locking up the office building after hours, I caught sight of her. She was standing under the dim light by the parking lot, staring at the HOA office door. When she saw me, she froze. "Karen," I said evenly. "You shouldn't be here." She clenched her fists. "This place was mine. I built it up from nothing. You stole everything from me." I shook my head. "You built a kingdom out of other people's dues. You forgot it wasn't yours to rule." For a moment, she looked almost fragile, the mask cracking just enough to see the exhaustion underneath. "You humiliated me. You humiliated yourself," I said. "You could have walked away with dignity. You chose war." Her lip trembled. Then she turned and walked away into the night, disappearing between the rows of cars. I didn't see her again for months. Peace returned, slowly but surely. The neighborhood finally felt like a community again. Kids played in the streets without fear of violation notices, and residents actually smiled at board meetings. The new leadership worked with me on a proper long-term lease for the office space, transparent, fair, and signed by everyone in good faith. It should have been the end. But one last surprise was waiting. A few months later, I received a letter, not from Karen, but from a bank. It was addressed to property owner, for 12 Maple Ridge Avenue, and contained a foreclosure notice. My heart jumped, but as I read further, I realized the letter wasn't about my property, it was about Karen's. Apparently, after losing her job as HOA president, she'd fallen behind on payments for her own house. The bank had officially filed foreclosure proceedings. Mia read it over my shoulder and exhaled slowly. Poetic justice. "Maybe," I said softly. "But I'm not celebrating. I just want this to be done." A week later, the "for sale" sign appeared in front of Karen's house. She was gone by the end of the month. Life went on. I focused on my work, my relationship, and the community I'd helped rebuild. Then, one spring afternoon, I found a small package in my office mailbox. No return address, just my name typed on a plain white label. Inside was a single item, the little wooden gavel Karen used to bang at meetings. Taped to it was a note written in the same careful handwriting I'd seen before: "It's yours now. Use it better than I did." For the first time, I felt something I hadn't expected: empathy. Maybe Karen had finally realized that control wasn't the same as respect. Maybe she understood, in her own way, that her reign had ended not because of cruelty, but because of her refusal to listen. I placed the gavel on my office shelf, right next to the lease file, as a reminder: authority isn't about volume, it's about responsibility. Oak Ridge changed after that. The neighborhood flourished. Property values rose, not because of fear, but because people actually wanted to live there. Barbecues replaced boardroom fights. Rules became guidelines, not weapons. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the sun dipped behind the rooftops, I'd look out across the street and think back to that first night in Suite 2B, the night Karen tried to throw me out of my own building. She thought she could silence me. Instead, she handed me the microphone. For the first time in years, Oak Ridge actually felt like home. No more threatening letters in the mailbox, no more secret fees, no more passive-aggressive announcements at community meetings. The air itself felt lighter, like the whole neighborhood had finally taken a deep breath and let go of the tension that had been choking it for so long. After the chaos with Karen, I expected a quiet stretch, and at first, that's exactly what I got. Weekends turned into long, peaceful mornings spent on my porch with Mia and a mug of coffee, watching the sunrise spill gold over the freshly cut lawns. The sound of kids riding bikes replaced the endless arguments that used to echo through the HOA meetings. People waved again. We weren't just neighbors anymore, we were finally a community. I had no interest in running things, but when the new board asked if I'd consider serving as an advisor, I said yes, on one condition: transparency. Everything, from budgets to maintenance decisions, would be open to all homeowners. No more board-only secrets, no more mysterious fees. They agreed. And to everyone's surprise, the change worked. Meetings became productive instead of combative. We started organizing volunteer days for cleanup projects. One weekend, half the neighborhood showed up with shovels and mulch to revamp the entrance landscaping. For the first time, the Oak Ridge sign didn't look like a neglected relic from the 90s, it looked like pride. People started trusting each other again. Even those who'd stayed silent under Karen's reign found their voices. A retired teacher named Mrs. Green started a community garden in an empty lot by the park. 2 teenagers designed a new HOA website that actually worked. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress, the kind that doesn't need a gavel to enforce. Meanwhile, I focused on my properties. The building where the HOA office was located, my building, was doing better than ever. With new tenants and steady maintenance, it finally turned a solid profit. But more than money, it symbolized something deeper. Every time I walked past Suite 2B and saw the HOA's modest sign on the frosted glass door, I felt that quiet, satisfied kind of victory, the one that doesn't need applause. Mia often teased me. "You realize you basically run the HOA from behind the curtain now?" I laughed. "I don't run it. I just make sure no one abuses it again." But she wasn't entirely wrong. Because the more stable Oak Ridge became, the more people started coming to me for advice. Not just homeowners, neighboring HOAs, property owners, even the city housing office asked how we'd turned the place around. Before long, what started as a local conversation became a small consulting project. I helped a few nearby neighborhoods restructure their HOAs, setting up clear budgets, transparent elections, and better communication systems. Most of them weren't corrupt like Karen's had been, they were just disorganized. Still, every success felt like a small redemption, proof that even a system as flawed as a homeowners association could work if people treated it with honesty instead of ego. That's when the city took notice. One afternoon, I received an invitation from the County Housing Council to speak at a community leadership seminar. They wanted me to share the Oak Ridge model. The idea of being on a stage, lecturing about neighborhood governance, made me laugh. I wasn't some academic. I was just a guy who'd gotten tired of being pushed around and decided to push back. But Mia convinced me. "You don't have to be a politician to tell a story," she said. "You just have to be the one who lived it." So I went. Standing on that stage, looking out at rows of HOA board members, city planners, and homeowners, I told them the whole truth, about how power turns toxic when it stops being questioned, how rules meant to protect can become weapons in the wrong hands. I told them about Karen, about Suite 2B, and about the night she tried to kick me out of my own property. By the time I finished, the room was silent. Then, slowly, people started clapping. Some even stood. Afterward, a man in a gray suit approached me. "Mr. Bennett, have you ever considered consulting professionally? There's a real need for people who understand both property law and community dynamics." I hesitated. "I'm not sure I'm the consulting type." He smiled. "Sometimes, the best teachers are the ones who learn the hard way." Within 6 months, what began as a hobby turned into a full-time venture. I started a small firm, Civic Land Solutions, specializing in HOA reform and property ethics. It was strange, in a satisfying way, to watch my personal war evolve into a professional mission. Mia handled outreach, I handled strategy, and soon enough, our calendar was full of meetings and travel. But success, as I learned long ago, always brings new storms. One summer afternoon, as I was reviewing client files in my office, my phone buzzed with a message that froze me mid-sentence. It was from James, our HOA president. "James, we've got a situation. You might want to come to Suite 2B. When I arrived, the atmosphere was tense. The board members were huddled around the conference table, papers scattered everywhere. James handed me a document. "This came in the mail this morning, certified. It's a complaint filed with the Zoning Commission." I scanned it quickly. The complaint alleged that the HOA office, my building, was operating a commercial enterprise inconsistent with community use. The kicker? It claimed the zoning variance that allowed the office to function had expired. "Who filed this?" I asked. James exhaled. "We don't know. The form was anonymous." But, he hesitated. The handwriting on the attached notes looked familiar. I didn't even need him to say it. My stomach already knew. Karen. Apparently, she wasn't gone after all. We traced the address on the filing. It led to a rented P.O. box in the next county. The timing made sense. Her foreclosure had finalized months earlier, giving her plenty of time to stew and plan. Mia put it best later that night. "She's not fighting to win anymore," she said. "She's fighting because she can't stand that you won." The Zoning Commission scheduled a hearing. It wasn't as serious as a lawsuit, but it was enough to cause trouble. If the variance really had expired, the HOA would need to relocate until it was renewed. That meant legal fees, paperwork, and months of delay, exactly the kind of chaos Karen thrived on. I pulled out the original permits and lease records. The variance hadn't expired, it had simply been misfiled when the building changed ownership. Still, proving that meant navigating a bureaucratic maze. I spent the next 2 weeks knee-deep in city archives, calling departments, submitting forms, talking to clerks who couldn't tell me which drawer my file had disappeared into. It was maddening, but by the end, I had everything I needed, official proof that the variance was still valid. At the hearing, I handed the documents to the commissioner and explained the situation. Karen, of course, was there, sitting quietly in the back row. She didn't speak, but when our eyes met, her expression told me everything. She'd hoped to catch me off guard. Instead, I was ready. After reviewing the papers, the commissioner nodded. "Mr. Bennett, your permit is in order. Complaint dismissed." I turned slightly, just enough to see Karen rise and slip out the door. That was the last time I saw her in person. After that, Oak Ridge settled once again into peace, a real peace this time, not the uneasy calm before another storm. The neighborhood thrived, my business grew, and life found its rhythm again. Mia and I got married that fall, right under the oak trees that lined the park Karen once threatened to redesign for aesthetic consistency. Half the community showed up. There were no violations, no speeches, no rules, just laughter, barbecue, and the kind of warmth that can't be legislated. As the evening wound down, James raised a glass. To second chances, for people, for places, and for every neighbor who decides to do the right thing when it would have been easier to walk away. I smiled, clinking my glass with Mia's. "To Oak Ridge," I said. Later that night, we drove past Suite 2B on our way home. The lights were off, but through the window, I could see the faint reflection of the new HOA sign, Oak Ridge Community Association, open doors, honest voices. And there, next to the door, hung a small framed photo, a picture someone had taken during the first volunteer cleanup day, when the entire community stood smiling in front of the entrance sign, hands covered in dirt, eyes full of pride. I hadn't noticed it before, but right in the back corner, barely visible behind the crowd, was Karen. She wasn't smiling. But she was there. I don't know who put that photo up, or why. But I left it. Because maybe some stories don't end with villains disappearing, maybe they end with everyone learning something, even if it's the hard way. Years later, when people ask how it all began, I usually just smile and say, with a meeting I wasn't supposed to attend. It sounds like a joke, but that's the truth. Everything, the chaos, the revenge, the rebuilding, started the night they tried to throw me out of a room I technically owned. Time has a funny way of sanding down sharp edges. What once felt like a war now feels like a lesson. Oakridge went from being a battlefield of egos to a blueprint for balance. New families moved in. Kids who used to ride bikes past my porch grew up and started helping with the community garden. Even the HOA office, once the stage for endless shouting, became a quiet hub where people actually got things done. Sometimes I'd walk by Suite 2B and catch myself smiling at the memory, not out of arrogance, but gratitude. That little room had taught me more about people, power, and pride than any degree or job ever could. Mia and I built our life around that understanding. Civic Land Solutions grew beyond anything I expected. What began as a side project turned into a national initiative. Cities invited us to train HOA boards. Local governments consulted us on conflict resolution. We even partnered with universities to study neighborhood governance. Ironically, I'd become the kind of person Karen once pretended to be, an authority figure. The difference was, I never forgot what it felt like to be on the receiving end of abuse disguised as order. And that's why, every year, I'd return to Oakridge for the annual community festival, not as a consultant or landlord, but as a neighbor. This year was special. It marked 10 years since the Great Meeting Incident, as people jokingly called it. The HOA had turned the anniversary into a tradition, a kind of living reminder that transparency and humility could heal even the most fractured places. James, now gray at the temples but still sharp, stood on stage with a microphone. Before we start the fireworks, he said, we'd like to honor the man who reminded us that rules mean nothing without respect. He gestured toward me. I tried to wave it off, but the crowd cheered. Kids who hadn't even been born during the old days clapped like they knew exactly what the applause meant. When I took the microphone, I didn't prepare a speech. I just spoke from the heart. I used to think revenge was the best kind of justice, I said. But standing here today, seeing what this neighborhood has become, I realize it's not revenge that changes things, it's rebuilding. It's believing that even after all the shouting, something good can still grow from the ashes. There was a pause, the kind of quiet that means people are really listening. Then I added, and if anyone ever tells you that you don't belong in a room, check the deed first. Laughter rippled through the crowd. It felt good. After the event, I wandered toward the park. The oak trees swayed gently in the breeze, their leaves whispering that old, comforting sound that had made me fall in love with Oakridge in the first place. Mia joined me, carrying 2 glasses of lemonade. You really became the story, she said softly. I shrugged. No, Oakridge did. I just stuck around long enough to watch it heal. She smiled. Do you ever think about her? About Karen? I nodded slowly. Sometimes. I wonder if she ever found peace. For a long time, we didn't know what happened to her after that zoning stunt. She vanished from public view. No social media, no property records, nothing. But about 3 years ago, I got a letter, handwritten, neat cursive, no return address. It said, Mr. Bennett, you were right. I confused control with contribution. I thought order meant obedience. Thank you for reminding me that community isn't about rules, it's about people. I've started over, quietly. I hope Oakridge forgives me someday. No threats, no sarcasm, no demands. Just that. I never showed the letter to anyone but Mia. We decided not to tell the board. Some stories don't need reopening. But I kept it, framed it, actually, tucked behind a photo on my office shelf. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder that even the worst conflicts can lead to clarity. Years rolled by. Civic Land Solutions expanded into dozens of cities. I stepped down eventually, handing leadership to a younger team. Mia and I moved to a small lakeside cabin about 20 minutes outside Oak Ridge, close enough to visit, far enough to rest. Every Sunday morning, I'd drive into town, grab coffee at the same cafe where the old HOA once held its private meetings, and take a slow walk past the office building. Suite 2B was still there. Different tenants now, a small real estate agency. But the door still bore a faint outline of the old HOA plaque, a ghost of lettering that time never fully erased. Sometimes I'd pause, just for a moment, and think about that night, the shock on their faces when I pulled out the lease documents, the way the room fell silent when they realized I wasn't bluffing. It wasn't pride I felt anymore. It was perspective. Because what started as defiance had turned into purpose. And that purpose, protecting fairness, demanding honesty, had shaped not just my life, but hundreds of others. One summer afternoon, I received an email from the County Archives Department. They were compiling a historical record of local civic milestones and wanted to include Oak Ridge's transformation as a case study. They asked if I'd donate any materials, photos, letters, meeting minutes. I hesitated. Most of it was personal. But then I realized that stories like ours only matter if they're told. So I gathered everything, the old notices, the eviction threats, even that first HOA fine for unapproved exterior fixtures. I boxed them up and delivered them myself. When the archivist flipped through the folder, she stopped at a photograph, the community cleanup day, the same one framed inside Suite 2B all those years ago. "Who's that?" she asked, pointing to the woman in the corner. I smiled faintly. "That's a long story," I said. She looked intrigued. Good ones usually are. A few months later, Oak Ridge hosted a civic exhibition in partnership with the county. They displayed a timeline of the community's transformation, photos, newspaper clippings, and even one of my old meeting notices marked in red ink. At the end of the display was a plaque that read, "Oak Ridge, proof that accountability builds community." As I stood there reading it, a teenage boy tapped my shoulder. "You're Mr. Bennett, right?" he asked. "My parents said you helped fix this place when it was falling apart." I smiled. "Something like that." He nodded thoughtfully. "Cool. I'm running for the youth council next year. Maybe I'll do what you did." That made me laugh. "I hope you do it better," I said. Later that evening, Mia and I watched the sunset from our porch, the sky painted in the same amber tones it had been the day I first bought the Oak Ridge property. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked. I took a deep breath. "Not the fights. But the purpose?" "Sometimes." She leaned against me. "You built something that lasted. That's purpose enough." I looked out across the lake, the reflection of the sky shimmering on the water. "Funny how it all started with a meeting." She laughed. "And a stubborn man who wouldn't leave." "Technically," I said, grinning, "a stubborn landlord." We both laughed, the kind of deep, quiet laugh that only comes when life finally feels complete. A year later, I got a call from the new HOA president, a young woman named Clara who'd grown up in Oak Ridge. "We're planning to rename the community center," she said. "We'd like your permission to call it the Bennett Hall." I froze. That's too much." "You don't have to," she cut me off. "We want to. Because it's not just about you. It's about what you taught us, that fairness can fight back." When the ribbon-cutting day arrived, I stood quietly at the edge of the crowd, watching as kids ran through the new hall, laughing. My name was on the plaque, sure, but what mattered was the inscription beneath it, dedicated to everyone who stood their ground and made Oak Ridge a home again. That line said everything I'd ever wanted to say. As the sun dipped behind the roofs and the laughter of the neighborhood filled the air, I realized the story had come full circle. From being kicked out of a meeting to helping rebuild a community, not for power, not for revenge, but for the peace that comes when truth finally wins. I squeezed Mia's hand and whispered, "Guess they finally let me stay in the meeting." She smiled. "Looks like they even gave you the building." And for the first time in a long, long while, I felt completely at home.